foreign affairs columnist for the Washington Post, an MSNBC contributor, and of course, a colleague of Mr. Khashoggi. David, I'm trying to figure out, why would it matter if Khashoggi had an association with the Muslim Brotherhood? Does that justify killing the man?
Well, it's shocking to have conservative Americans talking as if this part of his past in some way excuses or explains this gruesome murder. I wrote in a long piece about Jamal a week ago. All those details are true. He was a Muslim brother. He did know Osama bin Laden. What's remarkable about him is that in the middle of his life, he came to understand that violence and extremism were destroying the Arab world. And he became a believer in the power of journalism, the power of fact to change people. And he crusaded for it. It's rare to find a person who looks danger in the face in our business and goes ahead, and he did.
So what you're saying is that this is a story that should be elevated and celebrated. The whole idea of what we've, if you go back to what George W. Bush about trying to spread freedom and democracy, and we're trying to have these conversations. Here's somebody that was perhaps listening.
When the right-wing attacks on Jamal, based on his past, were circulated this week, I felt this is so wrong, but it gives people who knew Jamal a chance to say, yes, that's where he began, but he became a believer in the things that we as Americans cherish. Freedom, the ability to speak out, the ability to challenge your leadership. And he also became fearless in a way that I think people everywhere should admire. And in death, he is changing his country in the way that he dreamed of.
Funny you say that. Do you really believe that? Do you really think this is having an impact inside the kingdom?
It's having a huge impact inside the kingdom. I don't know where this is going to end up. It's clear that Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, would like to find a convenient fall guy to pin the blame. I wrote several days ago that
what does that do? I don't know. How do they think that helps them? Oh, it was an associate.
So if they could have an investigation and announce that this rogue killer, is the phrase President Trump kind of package it up for them as the way to deal with this. They could blame it on the rogue killer, and they have this deputy head of their intelligence service who they're kind of getting ready to play this role. If that would make it go away, they would do that. I think it's becoming increasingly clear that that's not going to work. That Mohammed bin Salman, his regime has become toxic. Mm-hmm. Global investors are fleeing, and Saudi Arabia has significant money problems. So, they're going to try Plan A, mm-hmm. and we'll see what the administration does. But if Plan A fails, I think they're going to have to move to Plan B. And what is that? It's got to be some change that says this era, symbolized by Mohammed bin Salman, is over. How that works, what role he has, I can't begin to say. I'm just saying,
crown prince.
If it
is that
well, so
and is the king with it?
So we don't know where King Salman is. We do know. I'll tell you one interesting fact. When King Salman decided that he needed to do something with Turkey to stabilize the situation 10 days ago, he sent a member of the Al Faisal family, a son of King Faisal, which is a different branch of the royal family, and he reached out to him, and he sent him as his emissary to Turkey. And Saudis that I talked to regarded that as an extremely interesting and important move that was separate by the king from what his son MBS would have done. Where's that going? We're gonna see, but don't think this is over.
All right. The president's comments just now, saying what he said, isn't that sending a signal to Congress? I'm going to veto a sanctions bill.
He may be trying to head off sanctions, and he's right to think that Saudi Arabia is an important ally. He's locked in a confrontation with Iran. It's important it's why he needs a stable Saudi Arabia. But I think he misjudges the degree of anger in Congress. Yeah. The Saudis don't have many friends in Congress. Just remember the JASTA issue. So, Lindsey Graham looked right in the camera and said, this guy's a murderer. He was speaking to Donald Trump. He was saying, Mr. President, don't do it.
Right. David Ignatius, thanks for coming on. Sharing what you know about your former, sadly, we think, former colleague. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.